Millions knew Michael Jackson as the king of pop. They knew the moonwalk. They knew the white glove. They knew the sold-out stadiums, the screaming crowds, and songs that seemed to belong not just to one generation, but to the entire world. But very few people knew what Michael Jackson's life had become behind closed doors. By the summer of 2009, one of the most famous entertainers who had ever lived was preparing for what was supposed to be an extraordinary comeback. 50 concerts. More than 1 million tickets sold. A new generation waiting to see him perform. And perhaps one final chance for Michael Jackson to remind the world why he had once seemed untouchable. Instead, only weeks before the first concert, everything ended inside a rented mansion in Los Angeles. Michael Jackson was 50 years old, and the circumstances surrounding his death would eventually send his personal doctor to prison. But to understand how Michael Jackson's life ended, we first have to understand how extraordinary and complicated that life had been from the very beginning. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, in Gary, Indiana. He grew up in a small house in a large working-class family. There were 9 surviving Jackson children, and music was everywhere. His mother, Catherine, loved music. His father, Joseph Jackson, had played guitar and quickly realized that some of his children had real talent. Michael had something more. Even as a very young child, there was something unusual about him. He could sing. He could dance. And perhaps most importantly, he understood instinctively how to capture people's attention. By the age of 5 or 6, Michael was already performing with his brothers. Soon, he became the lead singer of the group that would become the Jackson 5. For most children, elementary school means classrooms, playgrounds, friends, birthdays, and long afternoons with nothing important to do. Michael's childhood looked very different. There were rehearsals, more rehearsals, performances, travel, recording sessions, and enormous expectations. His father was a demanding disciplinarian. Years later, Michael spoke publicly about being frightened of him and described physical punishment during rehearsals. He also spoke repeatedly about something he believed fame had taken away from him. Michael once explained that while other children were outside playing, he was working. That contradiction would follow him for the rest of his life. The same childhood that created one of the greatest entertainers in history also left him longing for experiences he believed he had never truly had. In 1968, the Jackson 5 signed with Motown Records. And then everything happened very quickly. Songs like I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There became enormous hits. Michael wasn't simply a talented child standing in front of his brothers. He was the center of attention. His voice was powerful. His timing was remarkable. And even before he became a teenager, millions of Americans knew his face. But child stars eventually grow up. And the entertainment industry is not always kind to them when they do. Michael Jackson had to accomplish something extremely difficult. He had to transform from a famous child performer into an adult artist the world would take seriously. He succeeded beyond almost anyone's imagination. In 1979, Michael released Off the Wall. The album produced major hits and established him as an adult solo star. But Michael wanted more. He didn't simply want to be successful. He wanted to make something unprecedented. 3 years later came Thriller. And popular music changed. Thriller would become the best-selling album in history. Billie Jean. Beat It. Thriller. The songs became global hits. But Michael understood something about entertainment that many artists at the time had not fully embraced. A song didn't have to be only something you heard. It could be something you watched. The Thriller short film looked more like a miniature Hollywood production than a traditional music video. His performances became events. His costumes became instantly recognizable. And then there was the moonwalk. When Michael performed the move during the television special Motown 25 in 1983, audiences saw something that appeared almost impossible. He seemed to glide backward while walking forward. Michael Jackson had reached a level beyond ordinary celebrity. He had become a cultural phenomenon. At his peak, he could arrive almost anywhere in the world and create chaos. Fans fainted at concerts. Crowds followed his cars. Hotels became surrounded. Airports filled with people hoping to see him for a few seconds. He sold hundreds of millions of records. He won 13 Grammy Awards during his career. Presidents knew him. Movie stars wanted to meet him. Children copied his dances. Adults copied his clothes. Musicians studied his performances. For a time, there may have been no entertainer on earth more recognizable than Michael Jackson. But extraordinary fame can create an extraordinary kind of isolation. Michael couldn't casually walk through a shopping mall. He couldn't sit unnoticed in a restaurant. He couldn't simply take his children somewhere without security, cameras, and strangers following him. And gradually, the line between Michael Jackson, the human being, and Michael Jackson, the public character, became increasingly difficult to see. His appearance also changed significantly over the years. Tabloids speculated endlessly about his skin, his face, and his surgeries. Jackson said he had vitiligo, a condition that causes areas of the skin to lose pigmentation. But newspapers and television programs often treated nearly every aspect of his appearance as entertainment. Then came even more serious controversies. In 1993, Michael Jackson was accused of sexually abusing a child. Jackson denied the accusation. A civil case was later settled without an admission of guilt. Years later, new allegations resulted in criminal charges. In 2005, Michael stood trial in California. The world watched. After months of testimony, a jury found him not guilty on all charges. The verdict legally cleared him in that case, but the controversy surrounding his relationships with children did not disappear. Allegations and debates about Jackson continued during his lifetime and after his death. His defenders remained fiercely loyal. His critics remained deeply skeptical. And his public image became more complicated than ever. After the trial, Michael's life was very different from the superstar years of Thriller and Bad. He spent time outside the United States. His finances had become increasingly complicated. His famous Neverland Ranch was no longer the magical refuge it had once appeared to be. And despite his enormous catalog, global fame, and decades of success, reports suggested serious financial pressure. Then, in 2009, came an announcement nobody expected. Michael Jackson was going back on stage. On March 5, 2009, Michael appeared before thousands of fans in London. The event was short. He walked onto the stage smiling as the crowd screamed. He announced a series of concerts at London's O2 Arena. This is it. At first, only 10 shows were announced. Demand was extraordinary. The number was eventually expanded to 50 concerts. More than 1 million tickets were sold. Michael Jackson had not performed a full concert tour in more than a decade. Yet the public still wanted him. The comeback was real. And it was enormous. For Michael, the shows meant more than money. They offered the possibility of rewriting the final chapter of his career. Instead of being remembered primarily for trials, strange headlines, and controversy, he could once again be remembered on stage. Dancing. Singing. Performing. Doing the thing that had made him famous before he was even old enough to understand fame. Rehearsals began. The production was massive. Dancers were selected. Musicians rehearsed. Elaborate stage effects were planned. Michael worked closely with director Kenny Ortega. Footage filmed during those rehearsals would later become the documentary, Michael Jackson's This Is It. Watching it today can feel haunting. Because we know something Michael does not appear to know. We know there will be no opening night. We know the audience in London will never see the show. And we know that when Michael walks off that rehearsal stage, the remaining time in his life can be measured in days. People around Michael later gave different descriptions of his physical and emotional condition during this period. Some remembered an excited performer deeply involved in the production. Others expressed concern about how thin and fragile he sometimes appeared. One problem, however, was especially serious. Michael Jackson couldn't sleep. Insomnia had reportedly troubled him for years. And during preparations for This Is It, sleep became an increasingly desperate problem. This is where Dr. Conrad Murray entered the final chapter of Michael Jackson's life. Murray was a cardiologist who became Jackson's personal physician. He was being paid to accompany Michael during preparations for the concerts and was expected to travel with him to London. But the relationship between doctor and patient became deeply unusual. According to evidence later presented in court, Michael was being given medications to help him sleep. Among them was something that should immediately stand out: propofol. Propofol is not an ordinary sleeping pill. It is a powerful intravenous anesthetic used to sedate patients during medical procedures. In hospitals, patients receiving it are carefully monitored because the drug can dangerously suppress breathing and cardiovascular function. Yet Michael Jackson was receiving propofol in his bedroom. At home. Not in an operating room. Not in an intensive care unit. In a private mansion. Jackson reportedly referred to the drug as his milk because of its white appearance. For someone desperate for sleep, propofol could create unconsciousness quickly. But unconsciousness created by anesthesia is not the same thing as natural sleep. And without proper medical monitoring, the risk could be catastrophic. June 24, 2009. Michael Jackson went to rehearsal at the Staples Center in Los Angeles. Those who saw him perform that night would later remember it as an encouraging rehearsal. He practiced songs and choreography. He worked on the show. He appeared to be moving toward opening night. Then he returned home. It would be the last night of his life. According to the case presented during Conrad Murray's trial, Michael once again struggled to sleep. Murray later told investigators that he gave Jackson several medications during the night and morning. Eventually, propofol was administered. Exactly what happened during the following period became one of the central questions in the investigation. But at some point, Michael Jackson stopped breathing. The man who had performed in front of millions. The man whose concerts required enormous security. The man whose every public appearance could become international news. Was lying unconscious in a bedroom. And for a crucial period of time, almost no one outside the house knew anything was wrong. At 12:21 p.m., a 911 call was placed from the property. Paramedics arrived minutes later. Michael had no pulse. They attempted CPR. They tried to revive him. He was transported to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. Doctors continued trying to save him. But there was nothing they could do. At 2:26 p.m. on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. Then the news escaped the hospital. At first, it seemed like another impossible celebrity rumor. Then major news organizations began confirming it. Michael Jackson was dead. Websites struggled under massive traffic. Television networks interrupted normal programming. Radio stations began playing his songs. People gathered outside the hospital. Others traveled to places connected with his life. Fans cried in streets thousands of miles away from Los Angeles. People who had never met Michael Jackson felt as if someone from their own childhood had disappeared. Because for millions of people, he had always been there. But almost immediately, another question emerged. How could a 50-year-old man preparing for a major concert series suddenly die? The autopsy and toxicology investigation provided the answer. The Los Angeles County coroner determined that Michael Jackson died from acute propofol intoxication, with other sedative drugs contributing. His death was classified as a homicide. That word can sound confusing. It did not mean investigators believed Conrad Murray had intentionally decided to kill Michael Jackson. It meant Jackson's death had resulted from the actions of another person. The focus of the investigation turned toward his doctor. Prosecutors argued that Conrad Murray had violated basic standards of medical care. Propofol had been administered in a home environment without the monitoring and emergency equipment that should accompany the use of a powerful anesthetic. The prosecution also argued that Murray failed to properly monitor Michael and did not respond appropriately once the emergency began. The trial became one of the most closely watched celebrity court cases of the decade. In November 2011, the jury reached its verdict. Conrad Murray was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He was later sentenced to 4 years in jail, the maximum sentence allowed for the offense at the time. He ultimately spent roughly 2 years behind bars before being released under California sentencing rules. The King of Pop had survived decades of fame, controversy, lawsuits, relentless media attention, and extraordinary pressure. In the end, his life was lost in a place where he should have been safest: his own bedroom. There is something particularly tragic about the timing. Michael Jackson died only 18 days before the first scheduled This Is It concert in London. For years, people had asked whether he could ever truly return, whether he could still dance, whether audiences still cared, whether the King of Pop had become a figure of the past. Ticket sales had already answered one of those questions. The world still wanted Michael Jackson. More than 1 million people had bought tickets. His comeback didn't fail. It never had the chance to begin. On July 7, 2009, a public memorial was held at the Staples Center. The same building where Michael had rehearsed shortly before his death was now filled with family members, friends, performers, and grieving fans. His daughter Paris, only 11 years old at the time, spoke near the end of the service. For a few seconds, the global superstar disappeared from the story. There was no King of Pop, no Thriller, no moonwalk, no headlines, just a child saying goodbye to her father. It was one of the rare moments when the world was reminded that behind the almost mythical public figure was a real family experiencing a very real loss. Michael Jackson left behind 3 children: Prince, Paris, and Bee. He also left behind one of the most commercially successful catalogs in popular music history and an influence that remains visible everywhere. You can see it in modern pop concerts, in choreography, in music videos, in fashion, in the way major artists build an entire visual world around an album. Performers from different generations have cited Jackson as an influence. His videos continue to attract new audiences. His recordings continue to be heard by people who were not even born when Thriller was released. But Michael Jackson's legacy will probably never be simple. For some people, he will always be the greatest entertainer who ever lived. For others, the allegations surrounding his personal life remain an inseparable part of his story. Both his enormous artistic influence and the controversies surrounding him continue to be discussed decades later. And perhaps that complexity is part of why the world is still fascinated by Michael Jackson. His life contained almost unimaginable success and equally extraordinary isolation. He spent his childhood performing for adults, and much of his adulthood trying to recover something that felt like childhood. He became one of the most famous people alive, yet repeatedly spoke about loneliness. He earned fortunes, yet faced serious financial pressure. He spent decades surrounded by employees, fans, doctors, managers, and security, yet died in a bedroom while desperately trying to sleep. There is one final image that is difficult to forget. In the rehearsal footage recorded shortly before his death, Michael is once again standing on a stage. The music begins, and almost immediately, the years seem to disappear. The movements are familiar. The voice is familiar. The silhouette is unmistakable. For a few moments, he is simply Michael Jackson again. A performer doing what he had been trained to do since childhood. He couldn't have known that these would become some of the final images the world would ever see of him alive. He couldn't have known that the concerts he was preparing for would become a film instead. Or that millions of people would eventually watch those rehearsals not to prepare for his comeback, but to say goodbye. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009. He was 50 years old. His life remains controversial. His death remains tragic. But his impact on popular culture is impossible to erase. More than a decade and a half later, somewhere in the world, every day, someone hears Billie Jean for the first time. Someone tries to moonwalk. Someone watches Thriller. Someone discovers the Jackson 5. And for a few minutes, Michael Jackson is alive again. Not as a headline. Not as a controversy. Not as the patient in a courtroom investigation. But as the performer who once stood under the lights and changed popular music forever. His final comeback never reached the stage. But the music never left it.